Hello friends, welcome to Software Testing Help and the tutorial series on Postman. In this tutorial, we will be covering advanced scripts using Postman. As part of the agenda, we'll cover two topics. The first one being how to pass data between two requests in Postman, and the second will be how we can create workflows or request chaining using Postman, where we can control the order of execution of requests in the collection runner. Get started. We have created two separate collections to illustrate both the agenda articles. First one, let's see how we can pass data between requests in Postman. So I've created a new collection called Postman passing data between requests, and there are two requests in this collection. So we are using a publicly available API called request-response.in. You can simply go to any browser and navigate to this site request-response.in, and it's a publicly available API, and it provides some endpoints to test, basically like any API testing or any kind of performance testing that you want to do, and you need some fake data API, you can go ahead and use these. So we are using two endpoints from this. One is to get the user, this is get single user. It just expects a user ID with the endpoint and it will give you a response in this format. And second one will use a register endpoint which expects email and password in the request body and returns the response as this. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to register an user. Let's try hitting send. We get this response, and what we want to do is we want to capture the value of this ID in the return response and use it when we fire the get user request. So we'll be using an environment variable named user ID, and that user ID will be populated once we receive response from this register user endpoint. So let's write a script in the test tab of register user, and there are already code snippets available for these kind of requests. What we want to do is parse the JSON response and get the value of the ID attribute. So you can browse this and select the JSON value check test, and since now we are not writing the test, we can remove the test body from here, remove the expect. So now we are saying JSON data will contain the response that was received from the API endpoint. Now we want to set the environment variable named user ID to some value, say JSON data is the parent element, that is the base element, and we want the value of attribute ID, and that's it. So this should essentially set the user ID environment variable to the value that it received from the response, that is 4. And when we execute this get user, now since this environment variable is set to 4, it will be resolved when the first request it is processed or completed, and we'll be able to use that data from the previous request. So let's try to run this. Before doing this, we need to first create an environment so that the environment variable is set, and since it is no environment, the variable will not be set. Let's add a new environment called test environment. Just say add. Let's select the test environment. Now I'll click send. Let's hover on this environment browser, and you can see there is a new variable user ID that got added with value of 4, and this 4 came from the response that we received. And now let's try hitting this get user endpoint. we can see that it's now showing orange. That means it's resolved. And if you hover over it, you'll get to see the details. Let's click send and we'll get details for this user ID. So this is a simple way how you can pass data between requests and responses. And it's like this is the most simplest example that we have done, but you can always create complex scenarios using these features. So let's move over to the second agenda item of this tutorial, that is request chaining or building workflows using Postman. Workflows are essentially nothing but you control the execution order of the request in a collection. So ideally, the collection requests execute in the order they are present in the collection. That is, if you see in this collection, we have three requests like register, get, and login. If you were to run this collection directly without any workflow, you will see that the request will be executed in the same order like register user, get user, and login user. But there are times when we want to control the flow or order of the request execution, and that is when the chained request or postman workflow thing comes in handy. So what we are trying to do, again we are using the same API endpoints from request-response.in website, that is the open source or the freely available API endpoints, and we'll use three endpoints from in there. One is register, get user, and login user. And the flow of request will be, first will register the user, second we'll try to log in the user, and third we'll try to get the user details. So the flow of request will be register, login, and get user details. So now since it is not in the natural order of the as it's described in the collection, it will be a non-linear workflow wherein request will go from 1 to 3 and then to 2. So let's get started. In the register user endpoint, we have the body properly set. In test, we'll say postman dot set next request, and we'll have to give the name of the request where we want to pass the control, as in what is the next request that we want to execute. So I'll say login user, and this should be the exact name of what you see here in the collection, and that's it. So when it's running in the collection runner, it will execute this request register user, and in the post request scripts it will find that okay, now it has to transfer the control to next request, that is login user. So it will directly come to login user without going to get user. So in the login user, again we have the body. In test, now we want to transfer the control to the third request, that is the get user. So once the request execution completes, it will transfer the control to get user endpoint, and now the control will come to get user. So the last request that gets executed in this collection is the get user. But now there is a problem here. So let's first try running this in the collection runner. You just need to click this triangle icon and say run. It will show you the run order. So this is the default order that's there in the postman. You can anyways change these order from here and try running those requests. But again, this is not always desirable, because if there are like thousands of requests in a collection, you won't always be changing these order to make your workflow work. So that's why that scripting comes to our rescue. So let's try running this, and we can see that this keeps on running. This is kind of like this is stuck in an infinite loop. So let's try understand what's happening here. So first request was our register user, that was how it was defined in the collection. Then with our script, the control went to the login user and then to get user. But now let's see why did this login user request came into play. So if you go back to collection user, after get user, the request that has to execute as per the logical flow of collection is the login user. And so this is how the behavior of Postman application is. If it does not find any control statement here in the last request, that is the get user, it will try to continue the normal logical flow of the collection runner, and that's why it will try to go to the login user kind of request. And login user, since we are saying it to go back to get user, it goes back to get user, and then the cycle repeats. So that's why it is kind of stuck in an infinite loop. So let's see what we can do to avoid this. So now what essentially we want is to stop the workflow execution on the get user request. So what we can do here is on the get user request, we can simply say postman.set next request to null. So whenever the collection runner encounters such an statement, it will stop the execution of the collection at that point, and we will not be stuck in an infinite loop. So let's save these requests and try running this again in the collection runner. Okay, I'll say run, and you will see that this is how the workflow executed. First one was a register user, second one was login user, third one was get user, and the control stopped in there. So this is again an important feature where we can control the termination of the workflow as well by using set next request to null. And there is an important point to note here that within collections you might have like different folders, like you can create different folders like folder 1, folder 2, etc. So it is an important point to note here that you can jump to requests within a folder itself, not across the folders. So what I mean to say is if you would have like two folders, folder 1 and folder 2, and if there was a workflow that was described in folder 1, the folder 1 request will be able to call or jump to only requests that are defined in folder 1 and not to folder 2 and vice versa. So the scope or the boundary of the workflow is limited to the folder in which it is executing. If there are no folders, then you can basically jump to any request inside the whole collection. So that's it for this tutorial. Thank you.